I was just telling you before we hit record that coming to this country from Australia and having when I landed, no set political affiliation, I have encountered what you're talking about, where whichever side of the political aisle you end up on seems for most people to be more of a social thing. It's something that's sort of talked about as at parties, which party do you belong to, and whatnot. And so I have tried to resist that, joining just one side of the aisle. And as I can't vote yet, but I want to be able to. I want to make an informed choice. I do want to stand for something politically and be one of those. What did you say? It was 14 out of 100 that actually have a solid political
about 14
position?
Out of 100, yeah.
Okay, so I'd like to be part of that 14%. And you and I, Clint, did an episode on this, on how should you vote back when the elections were happening, and ran into the issue of, I don't know enough about how the world works. I bring some values to the table. Like nobody loves poverty. Okay, can we stop poverty? And can we, I'm pro people, however you want to phrase that. But in terms of which economic policy is best and how does the realm of agriculture work? And like, there's so much I just don't know anything about, that for me to even have confidence casting a vote for somebody is a hard point for me to get to, where I feel like, okay, I've gathered enough knowledge here, so I'm going to vote for the candidate who understands economics the way I do, or whatever. What hope is there?
And in fact, if I can piggyback on that, a few anecdotes from my time in graduate school, I met more people in graduate school that told me I will not be voting because I don't know enough than I ever do now out in rural America. Yeah. So even the people that I've met that are most informed, maybe not about politics specifically, just are educated rather, are telling me like, oh, I don't know enough to vote. It's like, oh no, like, even
you don't know enough to vote.
Right? Just think of what's happening.
We need you.
Is Tony on an island here in his his malinformed or his ignorance? What?
Yeah,
what's the stats on that?
It's funny that you guys say that, because there's this thing called the Dunning-Kruger Effect, which is somewhat controversial, but you probably heard of it. And it says basically the less you know, the less you know, the less you know it. So people who are badly informed about something, or just incompetent at things in general, tend to overestimate themselves, and people who are quite well informed tend to underestimate themselves. Right. I remember when I first came up with this idea about I had this paper I wrote a long time ago that argued, maybe if you're really uninformed, you're not doing your country a favor by voting, you should contribute in other ways. And I remember I discussed this with the great Australian political philosopher, Geoffrey Brennan, who I'm not related to, which is always disappointing to people who know us. And he was like, yeah, you're right, I probably shouldn't vote. And I'm like, Jeff, if anyone should vote, it's you. You're definitely you're in the top 0.0001%. But he's aware, because he's so well informed, he's aware of all this stuff that's pertinent to his decisions that he doesn't know. Whereas your typical person, they're not even aware of the facts that would be relevant to the decision. And as a result, it's like if you're taking a final exam and you sort of went to the first couple days of class and you sort of know what the questions are, but you know the answers. A lot of times people don't even really know what the questions are either.
Yeah.
So what would be some of the questions that we'd wish that, I don't know, bottom 80% did know? Like what are some topics that would make you informed that?
Yeah. It's always a question, what counts as political information, because people say things, well, why does it have to be the stuff that, a political scientist might care about? What about things like the price of a bus ticket across town, or how much a gallon of milk costs? And I totally agree that those things are relevant, and people do tend to know at least those local facts about themselves. But you'd be surprised at what you might think are the most basic questions and what people don't know. So here's what the typical American does not know. They don't know who their congressperson are, or any of their congresspeople are, even if you give them a list with say 4 names on it, including the list of the incumbent. They don't know who the incumbent is, which is weird, because incumbents tend to win, and we don't really understand why they do, because Americans can't identify them. They don't typically know who the vice president is, but they know who the president is. If we are bombing a country, they typically can't find it on a map. Though interestingly, if they can find it on a map, that usually it correlates with them not wanting to bomb that country. They don't know the unemployment rate within 5 percentage points. They don't know what they can't guess in terms of absolute dollar amounts or percentage wise what the federal budget is spent on. So the typical American thinks that 8% of the federal budget is spent on foreign aid. It's not anywhere near that. They typically don't know any of the laws that have been passed in the past few years. So, for example, in 2004, they did a poll where they asked Americans, hey, do you know anything about the Patriot Act? Now, they don't actually test to see if they know anything. They just ask them, do you know anything about the Patriot Act? And only about a third of Americans claim to know anything. That doesn't mean they did, right? In the year 2000, there's this thing called the American National Election Studies, which is constantly polling Americans to find out what they know, including, especially specifically voters. They ask Americans, who's more conservative? Not Clinton. George Bush II or Al Gore, right? And a slight majority of people got that right. It was like 57%. But they asked them follow-up questions. Like, they're like, I'm aware that there's this word liberal and this word conservative, and they're supposed to attach to these people. But they asked them follow-up questions like, well, who's more in favor of abortion rights? Who's more in favor of environmental protection? Who's more in favor of expanding the welfare state? Who's more in favor of a militaristic foreign policy? Who cares more about civil liberties for minorities, etc.? The words that make these, the things that make these words meaningful, and the overall majority of Americans did not get the answers right. In fact, you got about as many people getting them wrong as got them right, and the others were just like completely random. So they know basically nothing. They typically know who the president is. They don't know which party controls Congress. After a year after like a major election, they don't remember that anymore. They know basically nothing. And unfortunately, in most other countries where we have data, we have much better data about Americans than anyone else. We get similar kinds of results. Australians are ignorant, Canadians are ignorant, Austrians are ignorant, Japanese are ignorant, Americans are ignorant. Like, talking about who's more informed is a little bit like asking like, which is the best of the F students.
Yeah.
So
that is so troubling, man.
Why is that? Why?
That's really troubling.
What is the leading cause of that level of ignorance? And I'm not saying I necessarily know a ton. I don't even, well, this might be the Dunning-Kruger effect, but I don't consider myself extremely informed. I mean, I maybe know some basic facts, but
you would have got me with all those questions for sure. I don't know much of anything.
Yeah, but you're not even eligible to vote. You're off.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. That's true. No one's asking for me for my opinion.
So what's causing that? Is it a problem with our education or something more deep and sociological?
Question. You know, I'm an educator. I work at a university. I teach business government relations and like political science type things and political economy and so on. So what I'm about to say troubles me quite a bit. Education as an independent variable has a very weak effect on what people know about politics. Pew does a battery every few years where they ask Americans what they know about politics. And as an independent variable, going from having a high school diploma to having a bachelor's degree predicts you get about one extra question right out of 30. That's it. Educated people tend to know more, but in fact, things like IQ and money and interest are what's doing the work. It's not other stuff. So here's the leading explanation. It's called rational ignorance. So as an educator, I find this out. I have to see the same thing. I have students that come to my class, they take a test. 6 months later, they've forgotten 90% of the material. You know, after people graduate from college, they forget almost everything that they've learned. I was a chemistry major as an undergrad. I forgot almost all of it. I used to be fluent in like Latin. I forgot almost all of it. I used to be fluent in Spanish. I hardly ever use it, so I remember just the basics. I don't even remember like papers that I wrote 15 years ago. I forget them because they're not useful to me. So rational ignorance claims that people tend to be informed about something only if it's useful to them or if it's interesting. Like basically they tend to be informed only if the benefits of the information exceed the costs. When it comes to politics, for most of us, the benefits don't exceed the costs because of the built-in defect in democracy. The thing is, democracy works. It spreads power out to the masses. But what that means is that your individual vote makes very little difference. To kind of illustrate that, imagine like you're taking a class in like, say, UC Berkeley. I think Biology 101 is like 1,000 students there. So imagine the professor says in the first day of class, I'm an egalitarian, so what I'm going to do is give you one final exam 15 weeks from now that'll be worth 100% of your grade. But because I'm an egalitarian, I'm not going to give every individual student their individual score. Rather, I'm going to average all of your scores together, and you'll all get exactly the same grade. And imagine people are stuck in this class, and they're, what you'd expect is that the average grade would end up being something like an F, not because people are stupid, not because they're bad, not because they're corrupt, but because if you study really hard, you bear all the costs and it barely affects the score. Like if the average score is going to be a 30 without you and you get 100 on the exam, then what happens is you bump the average up from like a 30 to like a 30.7. So why bother studying? And if you just slack off and like watch Netflix, you get all the benefits. So you would remain rationally ignorant of the information in that class because learning it doesn't really help your grade. Something like that happens with your vote. You as an individual have very little efficacy as a voter. The chances that your vote would say break a tie in the U.S. presidential election are really small. It depends on what state you're living in, thanks to the Electoral College. But if you're living in like California, on the most optimistic model that's out there in the literature, it spits out an arbitrarily low number of like maybe like 1 in 250 trillion chance of breaking a tie. Maybe in a couple swing states, you have as high as a, like, I don't know, 1 in a 3 million chance. But for most of us, our chances of changing the election are vanishingly small. We seem to know that, even if you don't know the exact number. So we don't usually invest in political knowledge unless we find it interesting. But finding it interesting, it's not necessarily going to force you to be right about it, because just imagine like you're going back in time. Like I transport you to medieval England, like the year 1000. Well, you better believe in like Catholicism and believe in it strongly, or everyone's going to beat you up and ostracize you, right? If I transport you to, say, I don't know, rural Afghanistan right now, like it would be beneficial for you to believe in Islam because people will punish you for not believing it, and you'll benefit from believing it. Something like that happens with a lot of political information. It's just useful for you to believe what people in your peer group believe. So we're not in a way disciplined to know the truth, and we have weird incentives to just believe stuff because other people believe it. So it's called rational ignorance. People don't know much because it's not in their interest to know that stuff.
I can imagine folks who are interested, but are maybe more interested in the soap opera like drama that sometimes goes on politically, as opposed to policy and best course of action as far as economics and that sort. Some people are interested in the show of it all, the spectacle of it all, but that wouldn't equate to the kind of knowledge that would make them a useful voter. Now, I'm interested, is what you've just described there, rational ignorance, is that sort of inevitably tied to scale? I mean, we just have so many people in this country. How many are eligible to vote? Do you guys know? I don't know off the top of my head.
Yeah, it's like about 210 million.
210 million. So if the problem is that, or at least part of the problem is, I am one of 210 million people who might vote, my vote means very little, and my incentive, therefore, to become educated on it is very low. How is that problem solved in a nation of this scale, this size?
Yeah, you're right. In a way, if you're going to just have a mass election, you can't solve it. If we were to do what Australia does and have compulsory voting, it would in a way exacerbate the problem, because your vote would count for even less. And in fact, studies about compulsory voting find, there's one study that says the opposite, but generally speaking, they find that compulsory voting reduces political knowledge, but not by much.
Okay.
So what you would expect is that having a relatively small polity means your vote counts for more. There's a higher chance that you'll break a tie, and people invest more knowledge. And you do see evidence of that with, say, having democracy scale down to a local level. People tend to be much better informed when they're voting on local politics. If you think about, say, the Swiss system, where, in the national level referenda, hardly anyone participates. They might get like 20 to 40% turnout. But then for like the local referenda, they have high participation. That's where it's very easy to get the information, and your vote counts for so much more. It's more worthwhile to use it in like an instrumentally rational fashion. So with some people, I have a friend named Alex Guerrero at Rutgers University, and one thing that he advocates is something called Platocracy. His idea is like, the point of democracy is to have everyone be equal, but that doesn't mean everyone has to vote every single time. And we want it to be representative, but again, that doesn't mean everyone has to vote. So what he says is like, how about what we do is have like citizen legislatures? We will randomly select, say, 500 people. Because we randomly select them, there's no pernicious influence of money or race or sexiness or whatever other stuff that like corrupts politics. And they'll be, statistically speaking, quite representative of the country as a whole. And we empower that group to make decisions about some small range of issues for, say, a few years. Like, you 500 people, you've been selected to be the ones that will decide trade policy. And you're going to have to deliberate and learn from experts and do other things. But, now you have at least some stake in it, because it's kind of like being a juror in a jury trial. Like, your opinion now really matters, and you better take it seriously, and you probably would. So he's advocating that as a sort of alternative to just straight electoral democracy, because, I mean, the incentives are perverse, and we can't really fix the incentives very easily.